Very important conversation coming through at the moment because we are looking at recent days and also in the last 24 hours because the debate is just deepening. All right, when we look at headlines around the world that have been stirred by comments that have been made by former US President Donald Trump, or US President Donald Trump, and his claims that suggest that South Africa's farmers, particularly white Afrikaner farmers, are being killed and have their land taken away from them. All right. So behind this noise lies a much layered truth about South Africa's agricultural landscape, one that holds both the challenges but also the triumphs that we've seen in our sector. And we've discussed so many of them on the program in the last year. So today on the show, I thought it would be essential for us to really interrogate this matter, but look at separating myth from fact. Very, very important. And we are going to be speaking to one of the country's most respected agricultural economists, Wandile Sihlobo, author of many academic writing, but also his recent book titled A Country of Two Agricultures. Wandile, also executive director at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa and a good friend of our show. Wandile, thank you very much for joining us. I think as we look at these statements and how they're unfolding, I think this is very important for us to look at the truth versus the narrative. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. I think let's start with that. Let's look at the headlines, Wandile. Let's talk about Trump's recent statements about farm killings, land seizures in South Africa, and the fact that they have sparked a lot of global chatter. So, from your standpoint as an economist and researcher, what's fact and what's fiction here? You know, people are very confused about what's missing from this particular narrative.
I mean, I think the starting point is that there are no wide-scale land seizures in South Africa, and there are no targeted killings to white farmers in South Africa. Much of what the president of the US has said is not a representative of the reality on the ground in South Africa. It is in true, though, that South Africa has been undergoing what we call land reform program. But this program is on market-based principles where the South African government buys land, market value, from a range of white farmers for the purposes of land reform. It's been undergoing since 1994. It's under the process of a willing buyer, willing seller approach. So there's nothing really that is there threatening anyone on this basis. And when we have a strong constitution that also articulate what ought to happen in this country. If anything, the South African agricultural sector has actually saw much more prosperous environment since 1994. We are looking at the sector. If you're looking at its gross value added, it has more than doubled since 1994. Exports have grown significantly from $2 billion in the early 2000s to now around $14 billion. So the activity has been generally excellent, and farmers continue to invest in this sector because they know that it delivers the returns. So really nothing as the stuff that is outlined by the US president. We have a sector that is thriving here.
Right. Thank you for that, because what essentially you're saying is giving us a full picture of the health and structure of our agricultural sector as you and I speak. But I think what this has sparked, Wandile, especially for us here in South Africa, is for us to really interrogate the quality of our questions around what is happening, what is wrong, what we do need to fix, what the triumphs are as you articulate them in your response. And also, you know, what are these questions that we're asking? What are they provoking in terms of what is happening, but also what the future prospects look like potentially? So with that, as we look at the real state of South African agriculture, and move beyond this rhetoric as we see it, what does the current data actually tell us about crime and vulnerability in in the rural parts of our country where there's a lot of agricultural activity, I beg your pardon, that is happening. And this is across races. So it's not just Afrikaner people or black people, across the races. How do we have an honest conversation about the reality that is happening when we look at the crime statistics and how they're affecting farmers at the moment?
I mean, look, I think when one looks at South Africa in general, we do have a problem of crime as a country.
Mm-hmm.
And people experience, regardless of what community that they are in, there are unfortunate situations where people experience this. But I think we must be very clear that the idea that, the agricultural sector is targeted, and even they're targeting primarily white farmers, is incorrect. There are instances of crime that the South African farmers experience every now and then. But even there, it's not really racially targeted. There's black farmers that have been affected or been victims of crime, and there's been white farmers that have also been victims of crime. And I think what's important is for the South African police service and the law enforcement to ensure that we improve the security of rural communities in South Africa, but also security in general in the country, to say, let's fight crime and make sure that South Africa is in a better country than where it is. And I think the idea then that it gets to be targeted, I think it dilutes our attention to what as a country we ought to be doing. But I think for the agricultural sector, there's something in here that we also have to be careful about, because we are a sector that now exports about half of what we produce. So when we allow narratives that are not reality to go out there to say, hey, there's farm seizures, things are going so horribly wrong in the South African farming sector. Now, the people that are used to buying South African products, they may end up being in a position where they ask themselves, if is South Africa a reliable supplier? Will we still be able to get what we typically get from South Africa if these are the we are hearing about this country? And I think that it's important to protect the image of the South African farming sector. And the good thing about this is not that we are shielding anything. In fact, it's really about articulating the reality of what it is. Because there is no sector that is under siege that would actually be the only African country in the top 40 global agricultural exporters, the 32nd largest agricultural exporter in the world. Banks have put over 200 billion rands in the South African agriculture as the debt that they have extended to farmers. Of course, farmers are paying back that debt. The banks wouldn't be doing that, and people wouldn't be investing this money if the sector was not thriving. But the issue of crime, the point remains, is something that affects, I think, all South Africans, and we have to be careful about how we are addressing it. And I must say, though, that I articulate and say all of these things, not to say all is rosy in the South African agricultural sector. There are a number of things that farmers struggle with. The municipalities that are not delivering their services, roads that are not properly maintained, ports, we are seeing now improvements compared to what we had seen some few years ago. Even the government that is not doing its part by releasing the land that it has bought so that black farmers can participate at a much more stronger commercial level. And then we get to have this inclusive, prosperous agricultural sector. So there's a number of things in the system, animal diseases that are affecting livestock farmers massively and negatively at the moment. So there are a number of problems, but I think the ones that the US president is articulating are really imaginary, not the reality of South African agriculture.
That's right, yeah. Okay, we're speaking to Wandile Sihlobo. He is an agricultural economist, and we are just looking at US President Trump and what he had to say about our agricultural sector here in South Africa. Very important to interrogate this, especially ahead of the G20 summit that's taking place towards the tail end of November, 23rd of November, to be precise, is when it's happening. Wandile, let's talk very quickly two agricultures. Bridging that divide. It's something that, of course, you talk about in A Country of Two Agricultures, which is your book. And I remember you speaking of the deep divide between commercial and smallholder farming. So how do these statements, as made by Trump, distract us Or perhaps, if I could say, how do they highlight the real transformation work that still needs to be done here at home? Perhaps as we wrap up the conversation, let's look at this from a solution point of view.
I mean, I think these statements they stoke some of the difficulties that may arise in the country. Because I mean, let's face it, we are still a country that is coming from a difficult past
Mm.
and trying to build and get to somewhere where we all want to see a South Africa that is united and prosperous. And in the farming sector, it is true that that level of inclusivity still needs to be improved at a commercial level. The statistics are a bit foggy on this, but we have a rough estimation that black farmers are still making up less than 10% or so of the commercial agricultural output. Now,
Mm.
closing then that dualism and bringing more of them into the commercial level, because it's not that black farmers are not there. In fact, you have so many black farmers, but they are primarily at a smallholder farming level, while white farmers, you see them to a certain extent at a large-scale commercial farming level. So it's about closing then that dualism, not so much by taking from a white farmer and passing to the black farmer, but
Mm.
really about growing the agricultural pie. And the starting point is the fact that the South African government today is hoarding about 2.5 million hectares of land, which they should release with title deeds to black farmers, then tap into the commodity associations that are there. Either it's Fruit SA, it's Grain SA, it's Potato SA, and say, hey, can you assist in training these new beneficiaries that will
Right.
get into this land? And then talk to the land bank and the other commercial banks to come up with a blended finance solution of making sure that we finance these farmers. Then that process, carefully crafted over time, it begins to close the dualism. And we cannot rush in here. This is going to take generations, going to take time. But I think that as long as there are building blocks to do that, and I think the existing agriculture and agro-processing master plan, in part, it does speak to that. But I think the land release, it has to be another process. And I think as long as we are engaged in that journey, and then we don't focus more on some of the negative statements that are said falsely about our farming sector in South Africa, then we will be able to see progress and make some improvements from where we are in building a united and a prosperous agricultural sector in South Africa that delivers jobs and improvement in rural communities.
100%. And that's actually when you speak about rural development, I really enjoyed the conversation as we saw it on AgriView with Wandile Sihlobo on the internet, on YouTube to be specific, around agritourism. What is that exactly? How does it look? How can we shape people's perceptions around getting out of the coast, really exploring the entirety and potentiality of our country as our people really strive to reproduce themselves economically? I think this was so important. Wandile, thank you always. We will be watching you as always on AgriView on YouTube. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.